Jason Arday's story was almost too extraordinary to question. A man who said he couldn't speak until the age of 11 and couldn't read until 18 would go on to earn a PhD, become a celebrated public intellectual, and rise to one of the most prestigious positions in British academia.
What is your message to black children who are told that they can't do something?
Will always supersede skill because it's immeasurable. But apart from anything else, you must always believe that you can do something great, and hope springs eternal. And belief is everything. You have to believe you can do that. And surrounding yourself with the really positive people and good people, and repetition to hear those messages over and over again is really the catalyst of kind of developing that way of thinking and visualizing it, manifesting it, speaking it into existence, and always speak good of people. You've got nothing nice to say, don't say anything at all. Speak good of people, because when you speak bad, all of that takes away from whatever good may be coming to you. So always have a good, good thoughts, good deeds, good heart, and think about people in the best way possible.
Then people started looking closer. And the question was no longer whether one part of his story was wrong. It was how much of the story had ever been properly examined at all. For years, Jason Arday's life appeared to follow the shape of an almost impossible comeback. According to the story he publicly told, his early life was marked by serious developmental difficulties. He said he did not speak until he was 11. He said he could not properly read or write until much later. Yet somehow, the same person would eventually enter higher education, earn a doctorate, build an academic career, write and publish extensively, speak publicly about race and inequality, and reach Cambridge University. By 2023, he had been appointed to a professorship there and was widely described as Cambridge's youngest black professor. That achievement carried meaning far beyond one man's career. Arday's research dealt with race, inequality, class, education, and the experiences of people who had often been excluded from elite institutions. His personal history seemed to embody many of the themes he discussed professionally. He was presented as someone who had overcome extraordinary obstacles and entered a world that had once seemed completely out of reach. His story was repeated in interviews, profiles, speeches, and institutional material. And why wouldn't it be? It was compelling. It was hopeful. It seemed to prove that a person's beginning did not have to determine where they ended up. Then another story began to surface. At first, it was not appearing in the same places as the inspirational profiles. It was moving through academic circles, complaints, correspondence, and questions about Jason Arday's work. Those questions did not immediately stop his rise. That is important. While his public reputation continued to grow, concerns about parts of his academic record were already being raised in the background. The two stories existed side by side for a while. One was the story the public knew, the remarkable academic who had overcome extraordinary difficulties and reached Cambridge. The other was much quieter, academics examining his work and questioning whether parts of it had been properly attributed. Eventually, those two stories collided. And once they did, the controversy did not remain confined to one thesis or one allegation. The scrutiny spread. People began looking at his academic work, his qualifications, his career history, his charity claims, his public achievements, and parts of the personal story that had helped make him famous. Suddenly, the issue was no longer simply whether a number of passages in an academic document had been handled correctly. The question became much larger. How much of Jason Arday's public story had ever been independently verified? That question would eventually reach Cambridge itself. The university that had helped place Arday at the center of one of the most celebrated academic success stories in Britain would first defend him by referring to an earlier investigation, then later announce a new inquiry after receiving what it described as new information. Jason Arday would resign. He would continue to deny that his resignation meant he accepted the allegations against him. And then, before the wider controversy reached anything resembling a final public conclusion, the story took an even darker turn. Jason Arday died at the age of 41. His death did not settle the allegations surrounding him. It did not establish that his critics were right. It did not establish that he had been unfairly targeted. Instead, it left the entire story suspended between unresolved questions and irreversible consequences. And that may be what makes the Jason Arday affair so disturbing. This was never simply the story of a celebrated professor who was accused of plagiarism. It was also a story about institutions, about reputation, about what happens when extraordinary claims become part of a person's public identity, about the difference between asking a question and reaching a verdict, and about what can happen when doubts that might have been handled quietly and carefully inside institutions are allowed to accumulate until they finally explode in public. To understand how the story reached that point, it helps to begin with what people were actually questioning. Some of the earliest documented concerns about Arday's academic work were raised by David Harris, an academic who examined parts of Arday's PhD and other published work, and concluded that there were serious issues that deserved investigation. Harris contacted institutions and academic journals. He was not merely complaining about a missing footnote or an isolated citation. He believed there were substantial similarities between Arday's work and material that had appeared elsewhere. Jason Arday strongly rejected that interpretation, and this is where the story becomes more complicated than the version that would later circulate online. Being accused of plagiarism is not the same as being found guilty of plagiarism. Arday's doctoral work had already been examined by Liverpool John Moores University, where he completed his PhD. The university did not uphold the allegations in the way his critics believed it should have. The issues were attributed to what was described as honest and reasonable error. That finding mattered because it meant that, at that stage, there was no simple official conclusion that Jason Arday had deliberately plagiarized his work. His critics did not accept that explanation. Arday and his supporters pointed to the fact that the matter had been investigated and had not resulted in a finding of plagiarism. For a while, that disagreement remained largely outside public view. Meanwhile, Arday's career continued. He held senior academic positions. His public profile grew. He gave interviews and speeches. His personal story became increasingly associated with his professional identity. Eventually, Cambridge appointed him. From the perspective of an ordinary observer, there would have been little reason to question whether his background had been examined. A prestigious university had hired him. He had a doctorate. He had worked at other major institutions. His research had been published. His story had been repeated publicly. That sequence creates a powerful form of credibility. Once enough respected institutions have accepted someone, their acceptance can begin to reinforce one another. A journalist may rely on an institutional biography. An institution may rely on previous qualifications and employment. Another organization may repeat information that has already appeared in reputable coverage. After enough repetition, a claim can begin to feel established, even when very few people have gone back to the original source. That does not mean Jason Arday's story was fabricated. It means the mechanisms through which public trust is created are often less independent than they appear. And that became increasingly relevant as more people began looking closely at his background. The plagiarism allegations were only the beginning. Once they entered the public conversation, scrutiny expanded beyond the academic work itself. Journalists and online investigators began examining other claims associated with Arday's life. His qualifications, positions he said he had held, his charity fundraising, his endurance challenges. The unusual details that had once made his biography inspirational were now being examined from a completely different angle. Could they be independently verified? That change in perspective was crucial. When someone is admired, unusual achievements are often treated as evidence of how exceptional they are. When that same person comes under suspicion, those achievements can become reasons for further suspicion. The facts may not have changed. The lens has. That creates its own danger. Once one allegation gains traction, people can begin working backward through an entire life, treating every inconsistency as proof of a larger deception. A missing record may have an innocent explanation. A poorly documented achievement may be real. A biographical detail can be simplified or repeated inaccurately over time, without being deliberately invented. At the same time, repeated inconsistencies can raise legitimate questions. The difficulty is knowing where evidence ends and assumption begins. That distinction became increasingly hard to maintain as the controversy grew. Before the story reached the national press, another conflict had already developed around attempts to investigate Arday's work. Jack Grove, a journalist with Times Higher Education, had reportedly been examining plagiarism concerns and was preparing to publish a story. According to the account of events, Arday responded through lawyers at Carter Ruck, a prominent British law firm. The planned investigation was not published at that time. The dispute did not end there. Arday also reportedly made a complaint to the Metropolitan Police accusing Grove of harassment over his attempts to contact him during the investigation. The police opened an investigation that lasted for months before it was eventually dropped. The Metropolitan Police later reportedly acknowledged that the investigation should not have gone ahead. Arday also reportedly made a harassment complaint against David Harris. This is one of those parts of the story where interpretation becomes difficult. If Arday genuinely believed that he was being pursued by people who were crossing legitimate boundaries, then seeking legal advice and making complaints could be understood as an attempt to protect himself. If the people pursuing the story were asking legitimate questions about serious academic concerns, the same actions could appear to be attempts to discourage scrutiny. The available facts do not allow us to simply assign motive. What is clear is that the dispute had moved beyond disagreement over academic writing. There was now a conflict over who had the right to investigate, who was being harassed, and whether the scrutiny itself had become part of the story. For a time, most of this remained relatively contained. The wider public still knew Jason Arday primarily through the remarkable narrative that had surrounded his rise. But by 2026, that was beginning to change. The plagiarism allegations entered a much wider conversation. One of the figures who helped push them into public view was Nathan Coffness. That immediately introduced another complication. Coffness was not viewed as a politically neutral participant. He had publicly expressed controversial views about race and meritocracy, and was associated with positions that many people strongly opposed. That background became relevant to how the allegations against Arday were received. Some people argued that the campaign against Arday could not be separated from the ideological beliefs of the people helping to drive it. Others argued that an investigator's politics do not automatically invalidate evidence. Both points can be true. A person can have a clear ideological bias and still identify genuine problems. A person can also discover evidence while pursuing it for reasons that deserve scrutiny. The identity of the accuser should not replace examination of the evidence, but neither should it be treated as completely irrelevant. That tension would follow the entire controversy. The allegations were increasingly being interpreted through arguments about race, representation, meritocracy, academic standards, and politics. Jason Arday was no longer only a professor facing questions about his work. He had become a symbol in several competing arguments, and symbols are rarely treated with the same care as people. Eventually, the story reached the mainstream press. The Telegraph reported that an analysis of Arday's 2015 PhD had identified more than 100 passages that were similar to an earlier thesis. The allegations could no longer be dismissed as a private academic dispute. At that point, public attention accelerated. Cambridge initially stood by Arday, pointing to the earlier investigation conducted by Liverpool John Moores University. Jason Arday continued to deny plagiarism. The university's position reflected an important fact that was often lost in public discussion. There were similarities that had raised legitimate questions. But, at that stage, those similarities had not resulted in an official finding that Arday had deliberately committed plagiarism. That distinction did not slow the public reaction. Online, institutional procedures and legal standards often move too slowly for the appetite for a conclusion. The public sees an allegation, then evidence supporting part of that allegation, then counterarguments, then new claims. Before an investigation has finished, many people have already decided what happened. Once that process begins, every new piece of information tends to be absorbed into an existing narrative. If you believe Jason Arday was being targeted, every critic can begin to look like part of a campaign. If you believe he had deceived institutions, every defense can begin to look like protection. The story becomes less about evaluating individual claims and more about choosing which larger explanation feels most convincing. That is exactly what happened as the scrutiny widened. Journalists and investigators began examining more than the PhD. Questions were raised about qualifications, career history, charity activity, and other claims connected to Arday's public profile. And eventually, Cambridge's position changed. The university announced that it was opening a new investigation after receiving new information. Separate academic misconduct complaints were also being handled. That was a significant moment. Cambridge had initially defended Arday by referring to the earlier review. Now it was taking another look. The obvious question was what had changed. Had the earlier investigation failed to identify something important? Was the new information unavailable before? Had Cambridge relied too heavily on previous institutional conclusions? Or was the scale of public scrutiny itself forcing the university to re-examine questions it had previously considered settled? The public did not receive an immediate answer. Instead, the story moved faster. Jason Arday resigned from Cambridge. In his resignation statement, he said that the accusations, speculation, and public commentary had taken a serious toll on him and his family. He said he wanted to reclaim some privacy and bring that chapter of his life to an end. He also made a point of saying that his resignation should not be interpreted as an admission of the allegations against him. That left the central dispute unresolved. Resignation can mean many things. It can reflect an acceptance that a position is no longer sustainable. It can be a practical response to pressure. It can be an attempt to protect family members from further attention. It can occur even when the person involved continues to believe the allegations are false. Without an explicit admission, it cannot simply be treated as proof. But the timing mattered. Cambridge had announced a new investigation. Questions about Arday's background were expanding. The public scrutiny was becoming increasingly intense. Then he stepped away. And only days later, the story changed again. On August 14, 2026, emergency services were called to an address in Battersea, South London, where Jason Arday was found unresponsive. He was pronounced dead at the scene. He was 41 years old. Police said the death was being treated as unexpected but not suspicious, and that a file would be prepared for the coroner. There was no public official finding at that point establishing exactly how he died. That limitation matters. It would be irresponsible to describe speculation about the circumstances as fact. What was known was that police did not believe another person was involved, and that the case would proceed through the appropriate coroner process. But Jason Arday's death changed the emotional and ethical landscape surrounding the story. His family released a statement describing what they saw as a sustained campaign of abuse and misinformation. They said the pressure he had faced had become too much. People who had defended Arday saw the story through an even darker lens. Some pointed to warnings from people around him who had expressed serious concern about his well-being before his death. Others argued that the existence of serious questions about his academic work could not simply be erased because the person at the center of those questions had died. That created a terrible tension. A person can deserve a fair investigation without deserving a public pile-on. An allegation can require scrutiny, without every form of scrutiny being justified. A person's death can make the consequences of a controversy impossible to ignore, without changing the underlying facts that led to the investigation. These ideas do not cancel one another out. The problem is that public arguments often demand that they do. People wanted the story to resolve into one clear moral lesson. Either Jason Arday had been destroyed by a campaign that should never have happened, or the investigation had uncovered serious problems that institutions had failed to confront. But the evidence available in the public story does not support treating either explanation as a complete account of everything that happened. The more closely you follow the timeline, the more the case appears to be a collision between several different failures and pressures. There were genuine academic concerns. There were disputed investigations. There were ideological and political tensions surrounding some of the people involved. There were institutions making decisions at different stages with different information. There was a public figure whose personal story had become unusually powerful, and there was an internet environment capable of turning unresolved questions into a worldwide judgment before any final process had finished. That is where the deeper investigation begins. The most obvious question is whether Jason Arday made false claims or committed academic misconduct. But the story becomes more unsettling when you ask a different question. How did the institutions around him respond to the information available at each stage? Because Jason Arday did not appoint himself to Cambridge. He did not award himself a PhD. He did not independently create the institutional biographies that helped establish his reputation. He moved through systems that were designed to assess qualifications, research, and academic suitability. That does not remove personal responsibility if any allegations were ultimately proven. But it does make institutional responsibility impossible to ignore. If serious questions existed before the public scandal, what happened when those questions were raised? Who examined them? What standards were applied? What information was considered sufficient? And when Cambridge later announced that new information had caused it to reopen scrutiny, what did that reveal about the limits of the earlier process? There is a tendency to imagine prestigious institutions as nearly impossible to fool. That belief is understandable. The more famous an institution is, the more people assume its procedures must be airtight. But institutions are run by people. People rely on records created by other people. They trust previous employers. They accept qualifications from recognized universities. They use references. They rely on published work. They operate through systems that are efficient, precisely because they cannot independently reconstruct every detail of every person's life. Most of the time, that works. But when a person's story becomes exceptional, the assumptions behind those systems become more important. Extraordinary claims do not automatically mean dishonesty. They also do not become true simply because they are inspiring. The appropriate response is verification, not suspicion for its own sake, not worship, verification. And that may be one of the uncomfortable lessons in this case. Verification is not an act of hostility. A university asking questions about a candidate's background is not necessarily attacking that candidate. A journalist examining a public claim is not automatically engaged in a campaign. At the same time, investigation can become excessive, ideological, or abusive. The line between scrutiny and harassment is not always easy to define, particularly when the people involved genuinely believe they are responding to serious misconduct. The Jason Arday case forces both possibilities into the same frame. What if some questions were legitimate, but the way they were pursued became destructive? What if some institutions were right to defend him, based on the information available at the time, but still failed to investigate deeply enough? What if critics were politically motivated, but nevertheless found genuine inconsistencies? What if Arday had made mistakes that did not justify every conclusion later attached to his name? These are not convenient questions because they do not produce a clean ending. They produce a much messier possibility. That the story was never controlled by one person or one institution. It developed through a chain of decisions. One person raises a concern. An institution investigates. Another institution accepts the outcome. A journalist begins looking. Lawyers become involved. Police complaints are made. A critic with controversial political views enters the story. The mainstream press publishes new allegations. The public begins examining every part of the subject's life. An institution that once defended him announces a new investigation. He resigns. Then he dies. By the time you reach the end of that sequence, it becomes difficult to identify a single moment when the story could have been stopped. There were too many points where the direction might have changed. That is why timing may be as important as truth in this case. Suppose the academic concerns had been thoroughly addressed years earlier, before Arday's public profile reached its peak. If the allegations had been found to be baseless, a transparent resolution might have protected him from a later explosion of suspicion. If serious problems had been identified, earlier intervention might have prevented the situation from becoming a public crisis involving Cambridge, national newspapers, police complaints, ideological arguments, and the destruction of a man's reputation. Instead, the concerns appear to have accumulated, while Arday's public profile continued to expand. The higher the profile became, the more difficult it was for any future challenge to remain narrow. By the time the allegations reached the mainstream, they were not threatening only an academic position. They were threatening an entire public identity. Jason Arday was known as a professor, but he was also known as a symbol of overcoming adversity. He represented social mobility. He represented greater representation inside elite academia. He spoke about racial inequality. His biography made his professional work easier for the public to understand, because the two stories seemed connected. That symbolic role made the controversy more volatile. For his supporters, an attack on Arday could feel connected to wider hostility toward black academics and diversity initiatives. For his critics, the possibility that an inspirational story had been accepted without adequate scrutiny could appear to confirm concerns about institutions valuing symbolism over standards. The individual at the center of the case became part of arguments much larger than himself. And once that happens, facts can become weapons. One side points to the earlier investigation that did not uphold plagiarism. The other points to the similarities identified in his work. One side points to the political background of certain critics. The other argues that evidence does not become false because an unpopular person found it. One side points to the consequences of public scrutiny. The other insists that consequences cannot determine whether allegations are true. Each side can identify something real, The problem begins when that real thing is treated as the only thing that matters. The story then becomes a contest between narratives, rather than an investigation of evidence. And narrative has a powerful advantage. It is easier to understand. Jason Arday was an inspirational genius who overcame impossible odds. Jason Arday was a fraud who fooled elite institutions. Both sentences are simple. Reality may not be. One of the reasons stories like this become so difficult is that human beings prefer moral clarity, even when the evidence is incomplete. We want to know who was right. We want to know who should be blamed. We want the investigation to end with a person standing on one side of the line. But not every story ends that way. Jason Arday's death ensured that some questions would remain unresolved. There was no final public defense in which he could answer every allegation. There was no completed public process that could deliver a conclusion on every claim surrounding his life. There was no final moment where the public could watch the competing narratives collapse into one agreed version of events. Instead, the story stopped while the arguments continued. That creates another ethical problem. After someone dies, their defenders may feel that continuing to investigate them is cruel. Their critics may feel that stopping the investigation because of the death creates a different kind of dishonesty. Neither response is automatically correct. The responsibility of anyone examining the case becomes greater. The dead cannot clarify an ambiguous statement. They cannot provide a document that might settle a dispute. They cannot challenge a false accusation in real time. That means uncertainty should not be filled with confidence, simply because confidence makes for a more satisfying story. If something was established, it should be described as established. If it was alleged, it should remain an allegation, unless further evidence changes that. If an investigation reached one conclusion and another institution later reopened the matter, both parts of that timeline matter. If critics had ideological backgrounds, that context should be acknowledged without allowing it to replace examination of the evidence. And if public scrutiny had devastating human consequences, those consequences should be taken seriously without pretending they resolve the underlying questions. That may be the only responsible way to approach this story. Because the deeper lesson is not that institutions should never celebrate extraordinary people. It is not that journalists should stop investigating public claims. It is not that criticism is always politically motivated. And it is certainly not that allegations should be accepted as proof. The deeper lesson is about what happens when belief and verification become confused. Institutions need stories. People do too. A university wants examples of achievement. The media wants stories that move people. The public wants evidence that impossible circumstances can be overcome. There is nothing cynical about any of that. The danger appears when the emotional value of a story makes the ordinary process of verification feel unnecessary, uncomfortable, or even hostile. Once a story becomes useful, people can begin protecting it without consciously deciding to do so. A journalist assumes a university checked. The university assumes earlier institutions checked. An organization assumes the previous media coverage checked. The next profile repeats the same details. Years later, the repetition itself becomes the evidence. And when someone finally challenges the story, the challenge can feel outrageous, precisely because so many respected sources have already repeated it. This process does not require a conspiracy. That is what makes it more plausible. A system can fail through ordinary assumptions. No secret meeting. No coordinated decision to hide the truth. Just a chain of people trusting work they believe someone else has already done. Prestige can strengthen that effect. The more respected the institution, the less likely outsiders may be to question its judgment. And institutions themselves may rely on the reputations of other institutions. That creates a loop. Trust generates more trust, until something breaks it. In the Jason Arday case, the plagiarism allegations may have been that break. Once people began examining his academic work closely, they began looking elsewhere. And when Cambridge later announced a new investigation after receiving new information, the scrutiny acquired a different level of seriousness. The institution itself was now asking questions again. That was the moment when the story could no longer be described simply as an attack coming from outside. But even then, the final picture remained unclear. Cambridge's decision to investigate again did not establish that every allegation against Arday was true. An investigation is a process, not a verdict. The same principle applied throughout the story, yet it was often the principle most difficult to preserve. In the age of instant information, the existence of an inquiry can become public evidence of guilt. The opening of an investigation creates headlines. A complex conclusion months later may receive a fraction of the attention. That imbalance can permanently alter a person's reputation, even when the evidence remains contested. Jason Arday understood, or at least experienced, the consequences of that imbalance directly. By the time he resigned, the controversy was no longer limited to specialist academic arguments. His name had become associated with plagiarism allegations and broader questions about his life story. The internet does not easily separate a person from the allegations attached to them. Search a name once a controversy begins, and the controversy can become part of the name itself. For someone whose career and public identity were built around achievement, that transformation would have been profound. And yet, even here, caution is necessary. We cannot know every detail of what Jason Arday was thinking. We cannot assign a single cause to his death without an official basis for doing so. We cannot turn tragedy into evidence for whichever side of the argument we already support. What we can say is that people around him had reportedly expressed serious concern about his well-being during the period of intense public scrutiny. We can say that his family later described what they saw as sustained abuse and misinformation. We can also say that serious allegations concerning his academic work and background remained the subject of scrutiny at the time. Those facts exist together. They are uncomfortable together. But forcing one to erase the other does not make the story clearer. It only makes it easier to choose a side. The most revealing part of the Jason Arday affair may be how quickly people began doing exactly that. For some, the story became proof that elite institutions had abandoned standards. For others, it became proof that successful black academics were subjected to ideological campaigns designed to discredit them. For others, it became an argument about journalism, harassment, and the power of public accusation. Each interpretation selected part of the story and treated it as the center. But the center may be somewhere else. It may be the gap between what institutions know and what the public assumes they know. When Cambridge appointed Jason Arday, most people understandably assumed that Cambridge had done the work necessary to evaluate him. When Liverpool John Moores University investigated allegations surrounding his PhD, Cambridge later relied on that investigation in defending him. When new information emerged, Cambridge reopened scrutiny. At every stage, the public was being asked to trust an institution whose position could later change. That is not necessarily evidence of corruption. Institutions are allowed to revise conclusions when new evidence appears. In fact, they should. But revision has consequences. Every time an institution changes its position, it can weaken public confidence in the process that came before. People begin asking whether the first investigation was flawed, whether something was missed, whether reputation influenced the outcome, whether the new investigation exists because of evidence or because public pressure made inaction impossible. Sometimes those suspicions are justified. Sometimes they are not. The absence of an explanation people find satisfying can become fertile ground for speculation. And the Jason Arday story contains plenty of space for speculation. There are questions about how an extraordinary biography was accepted and repeated, questions about the handling of academic concerns, questions about the role of journalists and critics, questions about ideological motives, questions about why some concerns remained relatively contained before later exploding into public view, questions about Cambridge's shift from defending Arday to announcing a new investigation, and questions that may never now receive a complete answer. That does not mean every unanswered question points to a hidden conspiracy. Sometimes an unanswered question is simply unanswered. But it also should not be ignored merely because the answer may be inconvenient. The discipline required here is simple in theory and difficult in practice. Do not claim to know what the evidence does not establish. Do not dismiss evidence because the person presenting it is unpopular. Do not treat institutional prestige as proof. Do not confuse a compelling story with a verified one. And do not confuse an investigation with a conviction. The Jason Arday case sits precisely at the intersection of those failures. Perhaps the most painful realization is that different forms of failure can reinforce one another. If institutions fail to investigate serious concerns early enough, the concerns can later emerge in a much more destructive environment. If critics pursue a story in a way that appears ideological or personal, they can make legitimate evidence easier for defenders to dismiss. If supporters defend a person without confronting uncomfortable facts, they can deepen the eventual loss of trust. If the public decides someone is guilty before an investigation is complete, every later development becomes difficult to interpret fairly. By the time all of those forces interact, Nobody controls the story anymore. That seems to be what happened here. Jason Arday's life became a public narrative. The allegations became another public narrative. The conflict over those allegations became its own story. Then his death transformed everything once again. There was no longer a simple way to separate the investigation from its consequences. The question of whether scrutiny had been justified became entangled with the question of how that scrutiny had been conducted. The question of what Arday had done became entangled with the question of what had been done to him. And the question of institutional responsibility became more difficult, because the institutions involved were themselves part of an unfinished process. This is why the simplest explanation may be the least useful. The Jason Arday story was not merely about one man and one allegation. It exposed the instability of modern reputation. A person can spend years building credibility. A few days of intense scrutiny can destroy it. Both the rise and the collapse can be accelerated by institutions, media, and public attention. And neither process necessarily tells us everything about the truth. Someone can be celebrated too quickly. Someone can also be condemned too quickly. The first error does not justify the second. If anything, they may come from the same weakness: the desire to reach a conclusion before the evidence is complete. When Jason Arday's story was inspiring, many people wanted to believe it. When the allegations spread, many people wanted to believe the opposite. Belief moved faster than verification in both directions. That may be the deepest contradiction in the entire case. The same public that once celebrated the extraordinary nature of his story could later treat that extraordinary nature as evidence that the story should never have been believed. The facts had not necessarily changed overnight. The public's relationship to them had. The biography went from remarkable to suspicious. The academic career went from impressive to subject to re-examination. The institutional endorsements that once strengthened his reputation became part of the question of how the situation had been allowed to develop. And Jason Arday himself became increasingly difficult to see outside the arguments surrounding him. That is where this story should leave us. Not with a verdict we cannot support, not with a conspiracy theory about Cambridge, not with the claim that every critic was motivated by racism or ideology, and not with the claim that Jason Arday was conclusively guilty of every allegation made about him. The evidence does not justify that kind of certainty. What it does justify is a much broader question about systems of trust. How do extraordinary stories become accepted? Who verifies them? What happens when institutions rely on one another's conclusions? When should a warning become an investigation? What happens when an investigation fails to convince everyone involved? And what responsibility do institutions have when unresolved questions about a public figure continue to grow while that person's reputation continues to expand? The answers matter far beyond academia. The same pattern can exist in business, politics, charities, journalism, entertainment, and almost any field where reputation travels faster than verification. Someone is endorsed. Then another person endorses them because they were already endorsed. A biography is repeated because it has appeared before. A claim gains authority through repetition. Eventually, challenging it feels unreasonable. Then one person starts asking for the original evidence. If the evidence holds, the challenge ends. If it does not, the entire structure can begin to collapse. The collapse often looks sudden. Usually it isn't. By the time the public notices, the underlying questions may have existed for years. The Jason Arday story appears to fit that pattern. The public shock came late. The questions did not. That is why the timing is so important. The story did not begin when the mainstream press started reporting allegations. It began earlier, when concerns were being raised in places the public was not watching. For a while, those concerns and Arday's rising public profile existed simultaneously. One story was being celebrated. Another was developing quietly. Eventually they met. Once they did, the result was not a neat correction. It was a collision. The allegations expanded. The political context surrounding the critics became part of the debate. Institutions defended earlier decisions and then revisited them. Public attention intensified. Arday resigned. Then he died. No final resolution arrived before the story ended. And perhaps that absence of resolution is what makes the case so difficult to put down. There is no clean final scene. No document that suddenly answers every question. No confession that confirms the worst allegations. No single investigation that publicly clears every doubt. Instead, there is a man whose story changed from inspiration to suspicion, an academic establishment forced to examine decisions it had already made, critics whose motives became part of the controversy, supporters who saw a campaign against someone they believed was being unfairly targeted, and a death that made every earlier argument feel heavier. It is tempting to ask who was responsible. The honest answer may be that responsibility, like the story itself, is distributed. If any individual allegations were true, individual responsibility matters. If institutions missed warning signs, institutional responsibility matters. If public scrutiny crossed into abuse, that matters too. If ideological hostility influenced the way the story was pursued, that deserves examination. And if people ignored legitimate evidence because they were emotionally invested in what Jason Arday represented, that also played a role. Complexity can sound like an excuse for avoiding judgment. It is not. Sometimes complexity is the judgment. The failure is not always one person's secret. Sometimes it is the result of many people making decisions that appear reasonable in isolation but become catastrophic when placed together. A university trusts a previous investigation. A critic distrusts the university. A journalist asks questions. The subject sees those questions as harassment. Lawyers become involved. The police open an inquiry. The inquiry is later dropped. New evidence reaches the press. The public starts digging. Old stories are re-examined. The university changes its position. The subject resigns. Then the subject dies. At which point do you say the story became irreversible? There may not be one answer. That is the darkest possibility. Not that everyone secretly knew what was happening. That nobody fully understood where the chain was leading until it was too late to reverse. This is also why the case should not become an excuse to argue that scrutiny is dangerous and should therefore be avoided. That would produce the opposite mistake. Public figures and powerful institutions should be questioned. Academic work should be examined. Extraordinary claims should be capable of verification. Journalists should be able to pursue legitimate investigations. The lesson is not to stop asking questions. The lesson is to understand what questions are and what they are not. A question is not a verdict. An allegation is not a conviction. An investigation is not proof of guilt. A defense is not proof of innocence. A resignation is not automatically an admission. A tragic death does not resolve disputed facts. And an institution's prestige does not guarantee that every claim associated with one of its celebrated figures has been independently verified. If this story has one lasting value, it may be that it forces us to confront how badly those distinctions can collapse under pressure. Jason Arday's public image was built partly on trust. Trust in his academic achievements. Trust in the institutions that employed him. Trust in the accounts of his life. When that trust was challenged, the response was not a single orderly process. Different people began investigating different things for different reasons. Some may have been motivated by genuine concern. Others may have carried political or ideological commitments into the story. Institutions responded according to their own procedures and interests. The public filled the gaps with interpretation, and once the process moved into the open, no one could put it back where it had been. That is why the final question is not simply whether Jason Arday's story was true or false. It is whether the systems around him knew how to handle uncertainty before uncertainty became a spectacle. Did institutions have the right information? Did they ask enough questions? Did they rely too heavily on one another? Did critics pursue the story responsibly? Did supporters dismiss legitimate concerns because of who raised them? Did the public mistake intensity for certainty? Some of those questions may eventually receive clearer answers. Others may not. But the sequence of events already reveals something uncomfortable. The public did not discover a finished truth about Jason Arday. It entered the story while the facts themselves were still being argued over. That is why so many people came away believing completely different things. One person saw a man exposed. Another saw a man destroyed. Another saw institutions protecting themselves. Another saw ideological actors exploiting a vulnerable target. Another saw legitimate questions that had been ignored for too long. The evidence available can support parts of several of those interpretations without proving all of them. And that is the point at which a responsible investigation has to stop pretending that certainty is available simply because certainty would make a better ending. Jason Arday's story began as a lesson in possibility. A man who described profound early difficulties rose to one of the highest levels of British academia. Then that story fractured. Questions about his work led to questions about his wider public record. Institutions that had helped establish his credibility were drawn into the controversy. The arguments around him became political, racial, academic, and deeply personal. Cambridge moved from defending him through reference to an earlier investigation to opening another inquiry after receiving new information. Arday resigned. Days later, he was dead. And the questions remained. Perhaps the most unsettling question is the simplest one. What if the warning signs were never hidden? What if they were simply scattered across different institutions, different investigations, different people, and different moments in time? One person saw a problem with the academic work. Another relied on an earlier review. Another repeated an established biography. Another saw political motivation in the critics. Another believed the public scrutiny had become dangerous. Each person may have been looking at only part of the picture. By the time all of those parts were visible at once, the consequences were already irreversible. That is a much more ordinary kind of failure than a conspiracy. And perhaps that is why it is more unsettling. Because it could happen again, not necessarily in the same way, not necessarily to another academic, but anywhere a powerful story becomes accepted before it is fully tested, and anywhere legitimate questions are ignored until they can no longer be handled privately. The danger is not only believing the wrong story, it is waiting until belief and doubt have become so polarized that no investigation can occur without being interpreted as an attack. Once that happens, evidence becomes tribal, institutions become defensive, critics become symbols. The person at the center of the story becomes less human with every new headline, and the search for what actually happened can be replaced by a fight over what people need the story to mean. Jason Arday's story may never provide every answer, but it does leave behind a warning about how stories are built. They are not built only from facts. They are built from trust, from repetition, from institutional authority, from the willingness of people to believe that someone else has already checked. When that trust is justified, the system works. When it is misplaced, the consequences can take years to emerge. And when they finally do, the correction may be far more destructive than an earlier careful investigation would ever have been. Jason Arday was once presented as proof that an extraordinary life could overcome extraordinary odds. Later, serious questions were raised about the work and claims surrounding that life. Some were disputed, some triggered institutional responses, some remained unresolved. Then the man at the center of the story died before the public received a final account capable of settling everything. So the lasting mystery is not only what was true and what was not. It is how the story became powerful enough to be believed so completely, challenged so fiercely, and examined so late. Because sometimes the darkest turn in a story is not the moment everything falls apart. It is realizing that the signs may have been there long before anyone agreed on what they meant.